Hello everyone, you're listening to the Eiffel Tower podcast, a show all about Paris and France, hosted by me, Oliver G. And usually, and I mean usually as in for the past 4 years, every single Monday, this weekly show features a 30-minute interview with an interesting person who tells their Paris story. But these aren't usual times. In fact, if you're hearing these words, that means that I've already taken parental leave. Which I wish I could say it's because the baby is already born, but it's not. It'll be any minute, any second now. But I decided that instead of scrambling around trying to interview people in these important days and weeks, I'd rather focus on our little family. So what you're about to hear instead is chapter 1 of my 2020 memoir, Paris on Air. For the first time on this podcast, I'm going to share my Paris story. Now, if you never heard me talking about this book before, and I bet you have, this is all about my first 5 years in Paris. It's how I learned to fit into France, found love, got married, and went on a mammoth honeymoon trip around France on a little red scooter. Now, if you're sitting there and you're thinking, I'm not an audiobook person, should I really listen? Well, don't worry, this isn't an audiobook. This is an audio experience. You're going to hear original music, you're going to hear sound effects, you're going to hear voices from the actual characters in the book. Sometimes they even hung around for a mini interview so that they could share their opinion on the stories that I'd written. All this is to say, if you've already read the book, I guarantee this will be a whole new version of it for you. One last note, if you find yourself really enjoying this book, you can go on theeiffeltower.com/shop and buy a paperback version of it. You can even buy the full audio version of it if you prefer. And remember, get it from my shop and not some of those big sites on the internet, which we won't even name. And lastly, this audio was actually released every single day of the first confinement as a perk for Patreon members who've kindly agreed to let me share it publicly. If you want to unlock loads of extras, including the guide, the beautiful scrolls made by my brother Eddie that go with every chapter of this book, patreon.com/the Eiffel Tower. Sign up and join the gang. But that's enough from me. Let's get on with the book, Paris on Air from 2020. This is the audio experience, and I hope you enjoy it. Let's do it. Introduction. In this chapter, you're going to hear the voice of Lena.
That's me.
And
Hi.
I'm not going to say her last name because you don't know if she married me yet. For all you know,
No spoilers.
For all you know, she could just be someone off the street. Here we go. The ring weighed heavy in my pocket as we stepped into the cold Paris night. And it wasn't heavy because it was big. It definitely wasn't big. It was more heavy in the sense that I felt a crushing pressure from my imminent proposal. We were leaving a left bank party and were set to walk to Hemingway's bar in the Ritz. My plan was to stop on a bridge somewhere along the Seine River, to ask her to marry me, then to continue to the hotel bar. I double-checked the directions discreetly. A 20-minute walk, fairly straightforward. But as we stepped out into the crisp evening air on Rue de l'Odéon, a light rain began to fall.
Let's grab a cab,
she said. A cab? No. We have to walk, I thought. I can't propose to her in a taxi, can I? We don't need a taxi. Paris is beautiful when it rains, I responded.
I can't even walk. My shoes are way too small. Can we get a cab?
Should I throw it all in? Postpone the proposal? No. The timing is perfect. Don't be silly. We'll never find a cab, I lied. And the Ritz is just a short walk anyway. I lied again. We set off in the rain, or I suppose you could call it a light drizzle, almost a mist, really, and we made it down through the Christmas lights on the left bank to the Seine. But I could hardly breathe. The one ring was weighing me down. Where's the Pont Neuf? That's a romantic one, I thought.
The Pont Neuf? That's way behind us. It's the wrong way.
Oh God, I'm thinking out loud. The ring is controlling me. I need to regain control, find a bridge, get to the middle, ask her to marry me. The nearest bridge was the famed Pont des Arts, but even late on a Sunday night, there were still pedestrians crossing it. Through the drizzle, I swear I could see a man down on one knee. No good. Too much of a cliché. What's that next one up the road? It looks nice. It looks old. It looks romantic. Must get to bridge. Must destroy the ring. We got to the old stone crossing, the Pont du Carrousel, which led to the Louvre Museum on the right bank. The bridge was empty, not a person or a car in sight. It was perfect. I had to ask her right then. That, or I had to cast the ring into the Seine and be rid of it forever. I turned and looked at her, hair wet from the drizzling rain, eyes glowing golden from the reflected light from the Paris lampposts, feet swollen from the undersized shoes. Yes, the moment was right. "My precious," I began. Weird, I never called her that before. We've been in Paris for 3 years now, but it still feels to me like those first nights. Clueless, hopeless, and penniless. Those were the best nights of my life, and I want to spend the rest of my nights, and the rest of my days, with you. Will you marry me? I'd stopped breathing about 2 minutes earlier. I swayed. Time stopped. Then I heard her say yes. 4 times to be sure, and I breathed again. I slipped the ring on her finger, the weight was lifted, and she kissed me in the Paris rain. We moved on towards the Ritz Hotel with the lights of the Place Vendôme leading the way. This promised to be the start of something beautiful. Now, if I'd have known that on a honeymoon 6 months later, I'd be lying by the road in the French countryside in agony from a mysterious disease, I'd have thrown the damned ring in the river and jumped in after it. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Chapter 1. A dream apartment in Paris, a new life as a journalist, and a Swedish woman. 1.1. The arrival. Now that you know how the story ends, it's only fair that you know how it begins, and it's a lot less romantic, I can tell you. In fact, if you're only here for the happy stories, you should skip this section. You should also skip chapter 1.5, 2.7, and maybe even 8.2 if you don't like the sound of Lyme disease. Anyway, it wasn't love that brought me to Paris. It was hate. Evil, even. It was the terrorist attack on the Charlie Hebdo newspaper in January 2015. On the day of the attack, I was winding up my time as a journalist in Sweden, writing a fluff piece about a viral cartoon. I was putting the finishing touches on the story when one of the senior editors announced that Charlie Hebdo had been attacked, apparently by terrorists. I heard him say it from the other side of the room, and I wondered what a Charlie Hebdo was. I searched online for Charlie Hebdo, E-B-D-O, without the H, based on his pronunciation, and found it was France's main satirical magazine. Its unrelenting shots at religion had left it with enemies abroad. The editor came over to my desk and asked how soon I could be ready to go to Paris. "For Charlie Hebdo?" I asked, feigning that I was already on top of the story. "I can go right away." "Take the next plane," he responded. "You can come back for your luggage later." It wasn't meant to happen like that, but that's the nature of the news. You can't plan around it, and I'd soon learned this was especially true in France. The way it was meant to happen was that I'd head to Paris on a one-way ticket a month or so later. During this final month in Sweden, I'd planned to cram the entirety of France, its news, and its language into my head, so I'd arrive ready to tackle the country as a reporter. After all, like I said in my job interview, I was certain my university-level French would come back like lightning. And how hard could it be to get up to speed with French news? As it turned out, it took far longer than a month or two to understand the French, their language, and their culture. And I had no time for it anyway. France, and especially Paris, was getting its first taste of a series of horrific attacks, and the world wanted to know what was happening. I rammed some clothes into a suitcase and took the next flight out of Stockholm. Even though what followed was technically my arrival in Paris, it never felt like it. I had my head buried in the news and didn't stop to smell the pastry. And it was made worse by the fact that I was desperately unprepared to cover the Charlie Hebdo attack as a journalist. I had zero context about how it would affect life for Parisians because I wasn't a Parisian. I was no different from the hundreds of other foreign correspondents sent to cover the story. People call it parachute journalism, where reporters are dropped into a location and then pulled out again before anyone knows what's truly happened. I felt like I was a parachute journalist too, even though I was set to stay in Paris long after the parachute was packed away. The attack had taken place at the Charlie Hebdo offices in the 11th arrondissement, a trendy part of the city that I'd never heard of before. I'd never read a Charlie Hebdo newspaper, and at the time, I wouldn't have understood it if I'd tried. but I was there, talking to people on the street and getting their reactions to the attacks, which had left 17 people dead, mostly at the Charlie Hebdo office. But while I lacked the context, the truth is that journalists don't need to be experts on a topic to write about it. Anyone can ask what happened and record a reaction. And you can always fill in the context with a bit of extra time or a few phone calls. That's how all the foreign correspondents were doing it. But for me, in those first days after the attack, I was realizing just how unprepared I was for a life as a reporter in Paris. That weekend I joined in with the masses of Parisians who marched in solidarity over the attacks. They were putting on a defiant face against evil, and it was spectacular to witness. Not least because it hadn't escaped anyone that such a crowd would have been a painfully simple target for a terrorist. The march began at the Place de la République, where Parisians stood shoulder to shoulder and filled the enormous square. They held banners calling for peace, they sang the national anthem, they held hands. Reporting on the march, I was looking for a vantage point from which to take a photo. I worked my way through the throng to the middle of the square and climbed up onto the stone balustrades by the metro entrance. It was only then, standing on the meter-high balustrade, that I got a perspective of the scale of the march. The wide boulevards stretching from every corner of République were all flooded with people. As far as the eye could see, there were Parisians who were declaring resistance against terror. They say 2 million people marched, and the president at the time, François Hollande, said that Paris was the capital of the world that day. Yes, this was Paris. These were its people, and they were strong. It was a strange and historic time for the Parisians, and it was a strange way to start a new life for me, standing on that stone railing and try to understand it all. Little did we know that within a year we'd be going through it all again tenfold, when more terrorists struck multiple Paris locations in one night, killing 130 people. But this gathering was my first real look at the city of Paris and its people. Even now when I walk across République, I look at those stone balustrades and I think back to my first days in Paris. I think back to how admirable the Parisians all seemed to me that day. And I think about how much I wanted to be part of it all. .2 The Perfect Apartment. And in this chapter, you're going to hear the original voice of the French woman who emailed me. When the coverage of the attack began to wind down, it was time for me to move out of my hotel and into an apartment. I flew back to Sweden to gather the rest of my belongings and to figure out where I'd live in Paris. Now, what many people don't realize is that apartment searching in Paris is like hunting for wild truffles. Sure, you can find them. You can even find excellent ones if you're extremely lucky. But one thing's for sure, you need a lot of luck to find even a bad one. As it turned out, I didn't learn this lesson for several years because I was among the lucky ones. The perfect apartment landed in my lap before I even started looking. It came in the form of an email from a Parisian woman. She had also spent the past few years in Stockholm, and when she heard I was moving to Paris, she had offered to help. I responded that the only thing I needed was an apartment. On a snowy January afternoon, as I was set to leave Sweden for good, my inbox pinged with good news.
I think I found an apartment for you. It's typically Parisian, on the 7th floor, under the roofs. It's right in the middle of Paris, a perfect location, and the view is beautiful. You can see the Centre Pompidou from the window.
I had no idea that the Centre Pompidou was a modern art museum. I certainly didn't know that Monsieur Pompidou was once the president of France either. I'd figure all that out later. The email continued.
There are 2 rooms, and it has a bed, a fully equipped kitchen, a big working table, a bathtub, a washing machine, and a couch. And it's €750 a month.
This sounded too good to be true. There had to be a catch.
The only thing is the size. It's 20 meters squared. Don't ask me how they fit everything there. It's the magic of Paris. But you know, living under the roofs of Paris is part of the experience. You'll feel like a poet or painter. P.S. There's no elevator either.
Ah, well, there's the catch, I thought. It's tiny, and there's no elevator. But how bad could 7 flights of stairs be? And how small was 20 square meters? Or 215 square feet, for that matter? And what was a Pompidou? More importantly, who cared? A few minutes later, she'd forwarded me photos of the tiny apartment. The picture I liked the most was the view from the bedroom window. Hundreds of silver metal rooftops and red chimney pots stretched off to the horizon. Les toits de Paris, as Parisians call them. The rooftops that had inspired thousands before me and would inspire thousands more. The picture was incredible. What fortune to have a top-floor apartment in Paris with a view. I said I'd take the place before I'd even visited. The landlady sent me the details and the address. 48 Rue Greneta, 75002. Now, that address probably means as little to you as it did to me, so imagine my surprise when I typed it into Google Maps and found it was in the dead center of Paris. Yes, if Paris was a dartboard, and the city limits do indeed form a big circle, then my new address was the bullseye. I pored over the online map as my excitement built, learning that I was to live just seconds from the famed Market Street Rue Montorgueil and the pedestrian zone of the 2nd arrondissement. They were just words on the map to me at that point. In fact, I had no idea that an arrondissement was a district, nor that there were 20 that spiraled out across the city like a snail shell. And I didn't really care. Instead, I took a virtual stroll down Rue Greneta on Google Street View. It was narrow, paved with cobblestones, and full of little shops. It looked so charming, so old, so intriguing. I clicked from one end of the street to the other. Even the cobblestones were eye-catching, arranged in mesmerizing wavy lines. I researched the street online and found it was 800 years old. 800 years old, imagine! And what's this? The French author Honoré de Balzac had even described the street in an 1837 novel. But he seemed less impressed. He wrote that it was a street where all the houses, crowded with trades of every kind, have a repulsive aspect. The buildings are horrible. The vile uncleanliness of manufactories is their leading feature. By God, I'd gone too far. I snapped my laptop shut and hoped that Balzac was wrong. Surely Paris had cleaned up its act over the past few centuries, right? I finished packing my bags and headed to Paris to find out for myself. This time, on a one-way ticket. 1.3. Moving to Paris. You're going to hear a voice actor in this chapter. I didn't ever track down my landlady again, but I tracked down my next door neighbor in Paris. There's a funny story, I'll share it at the end. Here we go. A lot of people who move to Paris do it with a fixed time plan. You often hear expats saying, "I'm here for 6 months," or for those who've stayed on, "I was only supposed to be here for a month." But it was never like that for me. I booked a one-way ticket to Paris, and that was it. I'd spent the previous 4 years in Sweden, but that chapter was over. I had nothing and no one to stay for. Armed with a British passport from my English mum, I could essentially live and work anywhere in Europe. Australia, where I was born and raised, seemed like a distant memory and was inconveniently located on the wrong side of the world. I wanted to be in Europe. Europe was exciting, exotic, fascinating. It seemed to me to be the pulse of the universe, and I wanted to have my finger pressed firmly on it. And why Paris? Well, why not really? I'd grown up hearing my dad's tales of a summer he spent on a peniche on the Seine River. His dad before him had similar jaunts in Paris too. As for me, I'd half-heartedly studied French at university and now seemed as good a time as any to put my skills into practice. I also figured there was more to Europe than just Sweden, of course, and it was time to move on after 4 years. But I felt a tinge of regret leaving, as it seemed I'd made a name for myself in my last week in Sweden. I'd been in the far north of the country filming a YouTube video about the unusual way some Swedes say the word yes. Instead of saying ja, like the rest of the Swedes, they do a sharp intake of breath as if they were shocked or surprised. We made a 90-second video where I walked around asking locals about this bamboozling sound.
Here in Umeå, we say
And that means yes. How do you say yes? And it turned out it wasn't just me who found it amusing. The video went viral on YouTube. It had millions of hits in just days, and the story made headlines around the world. On the day I left Sweden, our little story was on the front cover of the biggest newspapers in the country. We'd tapped into something, a little language oddity, and people around the globe were curious about it. Sure, it was a silly story, but it made a big splash, and it seemed like a fitting bookend to my time in Sweden. As I boarded the flight for Paris, I was getting messages from Swedish media for my thoughts on this strange phenomenon, but I had to say no, as much as I'd like to have given a sharp intake of breath instead. Yes, I was getting on a flight to Paris, a one-way flight, and it was time to move on to the next challenge. There'd be no radio or TV interviews because I wasn't looking back, and there was nowhere to call from the flight either, so it was impossible anyway. Of course, I felt a regret too. When anything goes viral like that, there's often a ripple effect that you can potentially surf off into the sunset. But there was no way I could ride that particular wave in France. I'd have to try and start new ones. Yes, I was leaving Sweden and perhaps I'd never come back. That's what I thought. How wrong I was, but that's for later in the book. I arrived in Paris for good in late January 2015. My first week in Paris didn't seem real. I was so focused on the Charlie Hebdo attack that I didn't stop to think. But now it was different. I got off the plane at the Charles de Gaulle airport and I was hungry. Hungry for the food, the language, the people. Hungry to figure out France and whether Paris was as incredible as everyone seemed to think. And I was curious to investigate the culture, observe the idiosyncrasies of the French, and marvel at the oddities of their language. But as I strode through the arrival hall at the Charles de Gaulle airport, all I could think of was the telephone booths. Real old-fashioned phone boxes, the kind I hadn't seen in years, the kind that had been stripped from the streets of tech-savvy Sweden long ago. Stockholm is so advanced that even the homeless people accept payments by credit card. Seriously. But in Paris, there were still functional phone booths at the international airport. I don't know why it made such an impression on me, but those phone boxes stuck in my mind. I suppose it kind of felt like I was stepping back in time. I surveyed the rest of the grotty and unimpressive airport, which is regularly ranked among the worst in the world, and I thought, how on earth can a world capital like Paris be giving its visitors such a lackluster first impression? I splurged on a taxi to my new home, understanding now why a friend in Sweden had warned me to take cash. The taxi drivers didn't accept card payments. And mine didn't seem to accept the use of online maps either. He got us lost while trying to use a map book to navigate central Paris. Was he hustling me? Was he taking me the long way? At the time, I didn't know where we were going either. I didn't have any internet on my phone, and I was no savvier than the thousands of other tourists taking similar trips each day. The cab driver pulled up onto my new street, Rue Greneta, and parked on the curb outside my front door. Immediately, all my concerns about old-fashioned Paris were dashed away when I took in that entrance. I was gobsmacked. What a doorway. The kind of doorway that might make a Paris Instagrammer stop in their tracks. It was enormous, wide and tall enough to let through horses and carriages once upon a time. The double doors were set in an impressive stone archway that stretched up to the top of the next floor. The door had an inbuilt window behind which the gardien, or the building manager, lived. The wooden doors looked far too heavy to open, but a closer inspection revealed a normal-sized door hidden within. To the side of the door were mysterious stone ornaments that I'd later learned were in place to stop wagon wheels from damaging the frame. I stood there gaping at the building as the taxi driver pulled away. And just as my jaw finally closed, it was set to drop again. The landlady, a young Frenchwoman, opened the door and revealed the courtyard. As lovely as the Frenchwoman was, and she was indeed a lovely Frenchwoman, it was the courtyard that stopped me in my tracks for the second time in a row. It looked like a rainforest. The alleyway, paved with huge, uneven cobblestones, was open to the early evening skies above. It was lined on both sides with a wild array of greenery, trees several meters tall, and the windowsills on each side were crowded with plants and vines. And there, at the end of the alley, stretching 7 floors high, was the building I was to call home for the next 2 years. The landlady pointed to the sloping grey roof at the top, which had 2 windows facing in our direction, and she said it was my apartment. She looked me up and down. I had a suitcase in each hand, my whole life.
Is that all?
She asked, in English, thank God. I nodded.
You know there's no elevator, right?
Yep, I smiled and lifted both suitcases in one go. We crossed the courtyard and got to the winding, polished wooden staircase. The landlady hit the stairs with gusto, leaving me lagging behind with my heavy luggage. And I can tell you, even with the adrenaline that was pumping through my veins from this new chapter in my life, I didn't make it up the stairs without a few pit stops. Who'd have thought climbing 7 flights of stairs could be such a chore? But when I finally made it to the top, where the landlady was waiting for me with an open door, my weary arms and tired legs were soon a distant memory. I stepped into the apartment, and while it was tiny and bare, it was also incredible. The front door led into a living room with a sofa and a surprisingly big desk by a narrow window. It looked over Paris to the west. Behind a curtain was a separate kitchen, minuscule, but with a fridge, a sink, a stove plate, and big windows facing the north.
Look, that's Sacré-Cœur in the distance.
The landlady said, pointing towards Montmartre across the rooftops.
Not a bad view for while you're making your morning coffee, no?
The sun was setting, and I watched as the lights flicked on across the city. Not bad at all, I responded, amazed that I could count the sight of such a monument among my daily views. She continued the tour, leading me into the bedroom. It too was tiny, but arranged in such a way to make it seem spacious. The bed was a futon, positioned under the slant of the ceiling. Above the bed was another window, and the woman heaved it open, a tricky task considering it was built into the sloping roof. This meant you had to lift the whole weight of the window, then use the latch to prop it open. But the effort was worth it. Paris to the south stretched out before me in the crisp January evening, and it was glorious. Our building appeared to be a little higher than all the other ones, so we had a bird's-eye view of the city, and thanks to the long tree-lined courtyard below us, there was a good distance before the nearest block of flats, and that was much smaller than ours. All this added a superb effect of openness, perhaps a trick of depth perception, meaning it felt like we were outside of Paris and looking in on it. And the rooftops, of which we could see hundreds, were a beautiful mix of grey zinc sheeting and terracotta tiles, adorned with the same red chimney pots, all laid out higgledy-piggledy to the horizon. I'd already seen this view, of course. It was the one from the photo, but that photo hadn't done it justice. I could see for miles. The fresh air was a little too fresh for the landlady, who closed the window and brought me back to reality. The tour wasn't finished. Partly hidden by some big wooden saloon doors was my new bathroom, complete with a bath, which was also under the slanted roof, a handheld shower head, and a sink. Behind another closed door was a toilet. By my count, this was a 5-room apartment. The magic of Paris indeed. This seems a lot bigger than 20 meters squared, I said.
Oui, they don't include the space under the slanted ceiling.
She responded.
So technically, your whole bed is in a kind of negative space. It isn't counted. Neither is the bathroom.
She explained to me that most apartment blocks in Paris have tiny rooms like this on the top floor. They're called chambres de bonne, or maids' quarters, and were once home for the servants of the wealthier residents below. Now they're mostly used by students or people looking to save a few euros on accommodation. So, for a young man like me who was keen to live centrally, it made perfect sense to be living in a chambre de bonne. I was learning so much, but as pleasant as the conversation was, it wasn't long before I got my first taste of French admin.
Alors, we have to go through the condition of everything in the apartment,
said the landlady. Sure, I agreed. That sounded reasonable. What I didn't realize was she literally meant we had to go through everything. Everything. We spent the next hour walking around the apartment and checking the condition of every wall, window, and piece of furniture. We both had to write bon état, which means in good condition, as every last item in the home was reviewed. If there was a scratch on the wall or a crack in the window, we had to both write mauvais état. I thought it was a joke. I suggested we simply agree on the things that weren't in good condition, but that didn't fly.
No, this is just how we do it in France.
She shrugged. Turns out I'd be hearing that one again, and again, and again during my first months in Paris. The French have their own way of doing things, and if that involves plenty of paperwork, then all the better. The apartment papers were just the same, 2 full copies, handwritten and meticulously cross-checked. When the documents were all finally signed, there was a mood shift, and the landlady brightened up. We got to chatting again. She explained that her parents had used the apartment as a backup home, but had taken to renting it out in recent years. She told me that every tenant so far had been Japanese, all of whom had liked the practical use of space. She said, with a worried smile, that I was by far the tallest tenant too, adding that she hoped I didn't find it too small. Me, I'm 6'3", and she'd gauged it pretty well. The apartment was way too small for me, especially the shower, which I ended up using while in a golem-like crouch. She glanced at her watch, noticed that the evening had truly set in, and said it was time for her to leave. She handed over the keys.
One piece of advice.
she said from the doorway.
This place gets freezing cold in winter and boiling hot in the summer. You're right under the rooftop, so there's not much you can do to fight the elements. Just use some extra blankets in the winter and get a fan for summer. It's like that with all the chambres de bonne. You'll get used to it. Oh, and you'll get used to the stairs too. It gets easier after a while.
She went to shut the door.
Oh, and I forgot to mention. There is a communal toilet just outside of your door, but no one uses it. Most apartments have their own toilets nowadays, including yours. But check it out when you have a second. You can see the Eiffel Tower from the window.
I played it cool and smiled as we said our au revoirs. But as soon as I heard her footsteps fade down the stairs, I threw open the front door, rushed into the tiny bathroom, stretched myself over the toilet, and pressed my face up against the window. And, as promised, there she was, the Iron Lady, La Tour Eiffel. Granted, quite far away, but right outside my window, with nothing blocking the view. Before I even had time to take it all in, the tower lit up in sparkling lights, as it does for the first 5 minutes of every evening hour. I suppose it would have been quite a romantic moment, but I was all alone. And I was leaning over a particularly unkempt communal toilet. But I was in Paris, and I could feel the magic in the air. So I figured now's a good chance to jump in with a bit of background information for the first time on this audiobook. Hope you're enjoying it so far. That voice that you just heard was actually my neighbor in Montmartre, who has nothing to do with this book whatsoever, but we are on lockdown in France, and I was out on my little balcony, and I saw her, and I said, "Do you speak English?" We're speaking French, of course. And she said, "Yeah." And I said, "When you speak English, do you have a French accent?" And she said, "I think I do." And I said, "You might be perfect for an audiobook I'm making." And she was really cool about it. So I handed her over a book across the balcony to her flat and gave her her lines, and then she emailed them over that very same day. So who would have thought that the lockdown would bring neighbors closer in a way like that? I never would have guessed it. Anyway, there was a bit of a spoiler in that little comment too, because now you know that I end up in Montmartre, but that will come a lot later in this book. Let's crack on with it. Chapter 1.4, Rue Montorgueil. And in this chapter, you're also going to hear the voice of Stefan, who was my neighbor, and he's in the studio. Hello, Stefan.
Hello, Oliver.
It's been a long time since I've seen you.
Yeah,
How are you feeling?
I'm good, and you?
I'm really well, thank you. Are you ready for a trip down memory lane with me?
Yeah, I am.
And you'll hang around at the end for a little chat?
Yeah.
Great. All right, let's do it.
Let's go.
Rue Montorgueil is among the best streets in Paris, and the hardest one to spell. Because you guys are listening, I'll give you a bonus. It's Montorgueil. Right from the beginning, I thought it was the epitome of Paris. The road was lively in the morning as the fishmongers and grocers set up their stalls. The cafe terraces were crowded during the day and the bars were buzzing at night. It was unique, it was interesting, and it was a stone's throw from my front door. I spent those first few weeks much like a nervous tourist might. I often looked into the restaurants, but felt too self-conscious to take up a full table to myself. I picked a few spots that seemed to work fine for lone diners and favoured them to begin with. I still wasn't even remotely confident speaking French, and I ended up eating a lot of takeaway food. But while I didn't like eating alone, I had no problems exploring alone. Rue Montorgueil was fantastic in itself, but the whole quartier was rich in history that was in plain sight and still unfolding each day. Not long after I moved into the area, renovation workers found several mass graves under my local Monoprix supermarket. They uncovered the skeletons of 200 people, presumably the victims of a disease or a catastrophe. After all, the supermarket was built on the site of a 13th century hospital. But what was strangest of all for me was how no one seemed to care. The supermarket didn't even close down, and Parisians continued their daily shopping while archaeologists excavated the site below. My own street had once housed an 800-year-old hospital, and likely there'd been buildings there before it, maybe twice as old, and there I was, an Australian man in his 20s, trying to make sense of it all. Flanking the supermarket at the eastern end of Rue Greneta was Rue Saint-Denis, a road that stretched from the River Seine towards Montmartre. The street bisected mine amid a handful of sex shops, which sold porn DVDs with dusty covers, and all manner of sex toys. But I didn't know this at the time. If I was too nervous to walk into a restaurant, you can bet your last euro that I wasn't browsing around in sex shops. I checked them out much later in a drunken and giggly haze with the woman who'd one day become my wife. But I'm getting ahead of myself again. The sex shops were hard to miss. They were lit up in garish neon, often with aging strippers on the doorstep, smoking cigarettes and beckoning to the passers-by. Or maybe they were prostitutes. Hell, maybe they were neither. I never stopped to find out. But those neon lights caught my attention. There was nothing like this in Sweden, and absolutely not in the part of Australia where I'd grown up. I felt like I was at the center of the universe. And if all this wasn't enough, the district boasted exquisite covered passages from the 19th century, built so Parisians could go shopping without getting their feet muddy. The closest one to me was the remarkable Passage du Grand Cerf, built in 1825. Its glass ceiling 3 floors above let the sun sparkle down onto curious collections of shops, selling everything from jewelry to antique furniture. This was the kind of elegant attraction that people crossed the world to see, and for me, it was just a shortcut to the metro. Yes, it was safe to say that I loved my new quartier, but not everything was running smoothly back at the apartment. Several weeks into my stay, I still had no internet. I'd bought a new internet box, but it didn't work, and I found out pretty quickly that the only thing harder than living without internet in France is trying to get internet installed in Paris. Getting online was the first of my many bang-your-head-against-the-wall forays into getting anything done in France, and it wasn't a problem limited to just my apartment. On one of those early days when ducking out to the shops, I met my neighbor on the top floor for the first time. He was a young guy, curly brown hair, and he was smoking a cigarette by the communal window at the top of the stairs.
Salut mec.
He said with a broad grin. I never heard the word mec before, but I didn't want to betray my lack of French know-how this early in the relationship. He introduced himself as Stéphane, a student who'd come to Paris from the city of Grenoble in the French Alps, and he'd just moved in too. He asked if I'd managed to get the internet up here on the top floor. I told him I hadn't, but I must have said so in such diabolical French that he decided we'd continue in English.
I also have no Wi-Fi, why no?
He said. I figured Wi-Fi meant Wi-Fi, but it would be months before I figured what he meant by wino.
But if you get Wi-Fi, maybe you give me your Wi-Fi password and we share.
He said with a wink. Sure, I said.
Ah, merci.
He said, putting out his cigarette in an ashtray that apparently lived on the corridor's windowsill. He turned to leave.
À plus mec.
A few thoughts were going through my head as I walked down the 118 stairs. I'd counted them by now. First, why did he keep calling me mec, and what did it mean? Second, it was clear that both Stéphane and I were rubbish at each other's language. Perhaps we could teach each other, I thought. And third, how was I going to solve this blasted internet problem? So there you go, Stéphane. That was the first time we met.
Yeah.
Does it feel weird to be in the studio with me now?
It is a bit. I didn't think at that time that we will maybe in 5 years or like that in a studio. It's really funny actually.
It's pretty funny too that this studio is a chambre de bonne.
Yeah.
And so is your house and so is my house.
Yeah, I think it's the same side as ours.
Amazing. You're going to be featuring in this book a couple more times.
Okay.
So I'll say goodbye to you for now and hello in a few chapters.
Goodbye, Oliver.
Goodbye.
See you.
Chapter 1.5, The Raw Bacon. Now, in this chapter, you're going to hear the voice of my British editor, and hopefully it makes you feel like you're in the little office with us. Now let's get transported to the 19th arrondissement. Unlike the Stockholm headquarters, our Paris office in the 19th arrondissement was very petite indeed. It was just a startup at this point with only one other employee, the British editor, who considered it his duty to Frenchify me as quickly as possible.
You look like a Swede, mate. What's going on with that haircut? What's that jacket? You're in old Europe now.
He told me when we first met in January.
And have you got a French girlfriend yet? It's part of the contract, you know.
The editor wasn't thrilled by my lack of French and figured a French girlfriend would be the quickest fix. But there weren't any French girls in our office, and our office had no space for them anyway. We worked in a room with glass walls boxed off from an architecture firm that occupied the whole floor. As I walked to my desk each morning, the architects would raise an eyebrow and examine me. These architects would turn out to be my main source of understanding the French in those early days, but from the beginning, they were the ones who were observing me, as if I was some kind of Australian lizard, trapped from 9 to 6 every day in their glass terrarium. And they didn't seem pleased with their catch either. Their first complaint against me came within days of my starting the job, and my editor was the messenger.
Did you eat lunch in the reception area yesterday?
He asked me. Yeah, I think I did. They were all eating in the kitchen, there was no space, so I just ate on the go on one of the seats.
Right, well, there's been a complaint. The receptionist wants it to be known that the reception area is for welcoming people, not for eating lunch. They're a particular bunch, mate. Just watch your step.
But why didn't she just tell me at the time? I asked.
No idea. Just keep an eye out. And the French never eat on the go anyway.
What an unfair minefield. How can you avoid breaking the sacred French lunchtime codes if you don't know what they are? To make matters worse, I was still feeling self-conscious. I didn't dare to plonk myself down at the lunchtime table with the architects for their daily wine-filled feasts. I hated that I didn't speak good French, and I found it embarrassing that I wouldn't understand a conversation. Not least because I was working a job where I should be able to communicate in French. I felt like an imposter. The competence in French would come, of course, but in those early days it seemed impossible. So as far as lunch was concerned, I decided if I was going to eat in the office, I'd do it surreptitiously at my desk. But of course, that led to another of my downfalls. One day, I went to the local supermarket to grab some cheese, bread, and ham. I bought plenty of it and made a few sandwiches in a hurry in the kitchen to avoid the architects. I smuggled my loot into the office and wolfed the sandwiches down before anyone spotted me. You see, lunch for me has never been more than a necessity. Sure, I enjoy a good meal as much as the next man, but a sandwich would suffice for lunch on a workday. And where I'm from, it's not wildly unusual to eat at your desk. So that's simply what I did. I told the editor that there was plenty of leftover ham and bread if he fancied some too. About an hour later, he came back from the kitchen.
Mate, did you say there was leftover ham? I couldn't find it.
I headed to the kitchen fridge with him. Had the architects taken my ham? Surely they hadn't eaten it. But would I finally have a one-up on them? There it is, I said, grabbing the ham from the fridge. The editor raised an eyebrow.
Mate, that's not ham. That's bacon. That's raw bacon. Did you cook it before you ate it?
No, shit. I made it and ate it so quickly. What happens if you eat raw bacon? Yes, I'd eaten raw bacon and I didn't even notice. Perhaps it was the rush of the smuggle. Perhaps it was the shame of sneaking my own lunch into an office to eat in secret. Perhaps it was the fact that I have a terrible sense of taste in general. Or perhaps, the editor said, after we'd searched online for whether eating raw bacon will kill you, perhaps it was something worse. When the dust had settled and it was decided that I wouldn't die, the editor asked me the question I'd been dreading.
Mate, you know it said pretty clearly on the packet that it was raw bacon. Now tell me honestly, just how bad is your French?
The answer was obvious. My French was abysmal. We agreed that if I was to be carrying out even halfway decent interviews with French people, I'd need to improve my language skills. I'd promised the bosses that I'd pick French up quickly, and while I had studied it 10 years earlier, relearning it wasn't going to happen overnight. The editor suggested a refresher course, and I signed up that evening. As much as I didn't want to go back to French class, I figured that at least I could meet some new people. But the classes didn't start for a while, so I'd have to experiment with other ways to learn. Now, I'd been living in France for about a month, and I didn't have any friends, French or otherwise. So, in a country full of French people, just how are you supposed to meet them? I wondered. The answer, it turned out, was just around the corner. .6 The Guys. The French have a great word for a person who likes to wander about aimlessly. That person is a flâneur, or a flaneuse if you're a female. But before I knew the word, I knew the idea, because that's exactly what I was in those early days, a flaneur. I rarely knew what I was looking at or where I was exactly, and I certainly didn't have any context, but I loved it anyway. Working in an office from Monday to Friday during a Paris winter meant I had no daylight hours to explore the city, except during the tourist-packed weekends. Those first weeks and months I spent in Paris must have been what it was like for tourists in the early days. I had no internet, no plans, no ideas. I just walked and walked and walked. One Saturday morning I was on the right bank of the Seine River in an area I'd later learn was called the Marais. The houses were all built on top of each other with no room to breathe, but it wasn't claustrophobic. At least I didn't think so. I thought it was intoxicating and exciting. I felt I could pass through a passageway or a doorway or a courtyard and find a hidden treasure, and that's exactly what happened. One day I was exploring the Village Saint-Paul, a small collection of boutique shops, hotels, and restaurants, when a doorway opened onto the most stunning outdoor basketball court I'd ever seen. Despite the cold, a bunch of locals were playing an intense game of street ball, but even though I was a basketballer myself, that's not what caught my attention. It was the setting. Looming ominously and impressively over the north end of the court was the Église Saint-Paul Saint-Louis. Because most of the buildings in central Paris are 6 or 7 floors high, churches like this one often seem even more gargantuan. The court itself was flanked by a stone wall, the longest surviving stretch of the city wall that encircled Paris 800 years ago. It was built by King Philippe Auguste and was the envy of Europe at the time. Years later I'd develop a fascination with this wall, track down its vestiges, and plot its course among the buildings that had swallowed it up over the centuries. But on that day, I just liked the look of it, and I watched the basketballers sitting with their backs against it. Further along, children were kicking balls to each other, bouncing them off the ancient stones. Eventually I turned my attention to the court, and I was overcome by the need to be part of the game. The next day I arrived at the courts again, this time ready to play. But with my limited French that made me too nervous to walk into a restaurant, imagine how tough I found it to ask if I could play. It might sound silly, but summoning the courage to join in was one of the most difficult things I've done in my life. Now, this might not sound all that tricky, especially if you're a happy-go-lucky child reading this. But, as an adult in a foreign country, not understanding how the rules work, I found it to be very challenging. Let me put this into context. I've played basketball for my entire life. I know the rules inside out. I know many variants of how to play street ball, and I even realize how the rules change slightly from country to country. But even though basketball is a subject I could call myself an expert on, I was still nervous about joining the game. This is what it's like to start a new life in a new setting, especially in Paris. Sure, you may know how to order a beer in a bar, or park a car, or bring a gift to someone on their birthday. But when you're not sure how to do something in another language, your mind can play tricks on you. So there I was, just like a child again, just like a boy, standing in front of some other boys, about to ask if I could play. And I was riddled with fear. I picked my target, a guy standing with his back to the ancient city wall and watching the game. I started in French and asked him a vague question about how it all worked. Comment ça marche ici? I said, or something to that effect. Honestly, I probably said something more like, how it work for to play basketball with us in here today? I guess that's how it sounded to him anyway, because he answered in English. Perfect English, would you believe it? It turned out he was a Parisian who taught English to high schoolers. He decided to take me under his wing and explain that it was pretty straightforward. You make a team of 4, wait for a game to finish, then challenge the winning team. All you had to really do was make it known that you were up next. With that, he said I could play on his team. Then he yelled out something to the guys who were mid-game. Les gars, on a la prochaine! My existing knowledge of French was enough for me to know that he just announced we'd be playing the next game. But there was one bit that made no sense. What did you just say to them at the start there? Les gars? At least it sounded like les gars. Oh, les gars, he said with a chuckle. Yeah, it's kind of funny. It just means guys. Gars is short for garçon, which means boy. But it's just another way to say dude, mate, or mec. Ah, so mec means dude, I thought. That's what the neighbor, Stefan, had called me. But the les gars bit still didn't make sense to me. So why did you say les gars? Surely that means the guys, no? Ah, you've got a long way to go, my friend. You're not going to learn this language if you expect logical explanations. The best way is to repeat everything, like a parrot. Why do we say, hello the guys? Why do we think half of our nouns are masculine and half are feminine? I don't know, but everyone does it, and you should too. Thanks, mec, I said, deciding that I'd adopt my first bit of French slang. How lucky to have stumbled upon a language teacher to guide me through my first basketball experience. I had no idea at the time, but the guys I'd meet on this basketball court would become like a Paris family for me, and a huge source of learning about French people, their language, and especially their slang. Yes, I was lucky and I was ready to shoot some hoops. There was a whole world in front of me and I was ready to jump into it. And just like that, the game being played was over, and it was our turn to step onto the court. Game on, les gars. Chapter 1.7, another email. In this chapter, you're going to hear the voice of Lena.
Hi.
She is, if I'm setting the scene, if you're new to this whole world, at the time, this is just a Swedish woman.
It's just a random gal.
If you've listened to the show before, or you've read the book or whatever, you'll probably know she became my wife.
Spoiler alert.
But what we did here is, for this that we're reading out right now, it's Valentine's Day today.
Yeah.
And this chapter you're going to see.
It actually is.
There's a
2020.
so there's a bit of romance in this chapter that's coming up. It's set in 2015. So I think there's a romantic vibe in the air today.
Totally. The
5
mics
years.
are heart-shaped. My eyes are heart-shaped.
Here we go. Let's get into it. 1.7, another email with Lena. Belleville is one of those parts of Paris with a wonderful name. It literally means beautiful town, but it's the sound of the name that I like the most. Say it out loud. It kind of sounds like a very sexy Belleville. Belleville.
Belleville.
Belleville. Belleville. I like the way your tongue presses twice against the back of your top teeth when you say it. I like those rolling L's. Unfortunately, the place isn't anywhere near as beautiful as the name, but that will change. It's quickly developing and will probably be the trendiest part of this town. Heck, maybe it is already by the time you're listening to this audio experience. Paris doesn't mess around when creating trendy new neighborhoods. Anyway, the reason I was sitting in my apartment repeating the word Belleville in a sexy accent was because one afternoon I'd got another email that would eventually change my life. This time it was from a Swedish woman named Lena, who I'd met at a party in Stockholm.
Hey, I just moved to Paris for 6 months of study, and I don't know anyone here. So if you want to grab a drink, I'm in Belleville.
Unfortunately, the Swedes don't pronounce Belleville in a sexy way. They go overboard with the L's and they make it fun and silly like an ABBA song. Say it again.
I can't do it now. Belleville?
Do the Swedish version?
Belleville.
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 Yeah. But I wasn't complaining. I'd never been to Belleville. I'm going to say it in English. Belleville.
Belleville?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'd never been to Belleville. I was alone in Paris. I couldn't think of a better way to spend an evening than having a drink in beautiful town with a beautiful Swedish woman. So, I met her one winter night and we walked through the Butte-Chaumont Park, which is the closest thing Paris has to an Indiana Jones movie set. Afterwards, we stopped for a drink in a dive bar. I told her about my neighbor and my internet problems. She said her apartment smelled like cigarettes.
Ugh, I remember that. It was awful.
I confessed about the raw bacon and she told me how she'd locked her laundry inside a laundromat in Belleville. She was getting it all wrong too, and it was nice to be able to laugh it off with someone in the same boat. We were two strangers in a strange land, and we planned to meet again that Saturday night. Now, it's impossible to remember which of us chose Saturday night and whether that person knew that it was Valentine's Day, but to hell with it now, it was a great move if it was on purpose. Or a fortunate accident. We were both single, why not spend Valentine's Day together? We reasoned. It was a date, why not? And what better city for Valentine's Day than Paris? But how to do it? And considering I just paid the 2-month deposit on my new place, how could I do it cheaply? Surely it was easy to be romantic on a budget in Paris. Then again, how romantic do you want to get on a second date? Or was it a first date?
Was it even a date?
Was it even a date?
I don't know.
We decided to spend the evening taking a stroll to the Eiffel Tower. Neither of us had been there after sunset, and we were keen to see it up close for the hourly light show, the blinding sparkles, which I'd only ever seen from my toilet. Along the way, we stopped at a supermarket and grabbed a bottle of cheap champagne and some charcuterie, cold meat. Then we headed over for the tower. In those days, you could walk straight off the street and directly underneath it. After the attacks in November later that year, the city installed a glass wall that made it impossible to enter without going through security checks. But back then, on Valentine's Day in 2015, there were no gates, no fences, no queues. It was still wide open, beautiful, and carefree. It was my first time visiting the tower as a resident of Paris, and I loved it. I'd later learned that many Parisians have never climbed it, and they don't care for it. But I didn't feel that way. I thought it was breathtaking. We walked beneath the tower, stared shamelessly up under her iron skirt, then moved into the Champ de Mars Park, where the air was filled with the popping of champagne bottles. It wasn't until I opened our own that I realized we'd forgotten to bring anything to drink it from.
No matter.
She said, and took a swig straight from the bottle.
Like a lady. I surely can appreciate the finer things in life, but I'm not against taking a good swig from a cheap bottle of champagne now and then, once in a while.
She said, or something like that. Of course, I don't remember exactly what she said because I was thinking, wow, what a gal. The kind of gal who'd go out on a date with a guy like me. Now I realize it wasn't a date. The kind of gal who'd go out with, you know what? It doesn't even say it on a date.
No.
I just added that. The kind of gal who'd go out with a guy like me and not care that I'd bought the cheap bottle without any cups or glasses.
Well, I didn't know the difference, to be fair.
We'll get your thoughts at the end, Lena. Thank you. This is my date.
I'm sorry.
My thoughts were interrupted by a collective gasp from the crowd as the tower erupted into the hourly light show. Thousands of light bulbs all over the tower flashed and sparkled furiously, brilliantly, and romantically. Lena huddled closer to me and we watched until the sparkling died out. We eventually decided to head back to the city on foot and strolled along the Seine until we reached Rue de Rivoli in the fancy first arrondissement. A welcoming and surprisingly cheap-looking bar caught my attention. We went in and ordered a pair of gin and tonics as a nightcap. The drinks were cheap, which was perfect for a broke journalist and a student. The waiters were lovely, perhaps caught up in the romance of the night, or perhaps looking for a tip from two tipsy foreigners. Who knows? But what I do know is that they got chatting with us and seemed infected by our good mood. As we went to leave, the bartender produced 2 shots of liqueur from nowhere and insisted they were on the house. Do you want to do his line?
Welcome to Paris. I can see a great future for you two.
He said with a smile, and a waitress handed each of us a red rose.
Wee! Happy Valentine's Day to you both.
She added. We took the shot, said thank you, and headed into the street once again, positively intoxicated by the romance in the air. Or perhaps it was the liqueur. In fact, it was almost certainly the liqueur, because that's the only way I can explain my next ill-conceived idea. We walked along the covered footpath of the Rue de Rivoli, heading eastwards, past all the designer stores and luxury hotels. And then I was blinded. My eyes were hit by the sheer beauty of a hotel lobby. It was so luxurious, so opulent. I had to know more. Lena, look.
What?
We have to go in.
Oh my god, really?
We have to see what's inside.
Okay.
Let's pretend like we own the place. The interior was even more dazzling. It was almost too impressive. Like the sun, I couldn't quite look at it directly, and I let myself be drawn inside. A staff member walked past me carrying a silver tray. The chandeliers in the lobby reflected off the grand piano. We walked into the bar as if in a trance. It would have been a crime if we didn't take a closer look, wouldn't it? In fact, it would have been a crime if we didn't sit down and have at least one drink, no? We sat at the bar. Another 2 gin and tonics were the order of the night. And it would be my treat, I insisted, oddly forgetting that we'd just been guzzling supermarket champagne from the bottle. We enjoyed the cocktails as the love-struck, drunken, hypnotized days continued to carry us along. When the glasses were empty, the bartender slid the receipt to me. Before I even saw the price, my eye was drawn to the 2 words at the top of the paper, and I was snapped out of my dizzy haze. Le Maurice. Shit. Oh, shit. Were we at Le Maurice? One of the fanciest hotels in the entire country? Good Lord, I thought, what surprise fee awaits for me further down this piece of paper? I avoided looking at the price, and in mere milliseconds I sobered up as I cast a furtive glance around the room. It was only then that I really took it all in. All of the other patrons were wearing black ties and suits, and were the staff members actually wearing gloves? And those low leather armchairs, they looked like they probably had lost items of jewelry between the cushions rather than loose change. Bite the bullet, I told myself. Look at the bill. And so I did. And I wish I hadn't. 2 gin and tonics, 2 normal drinks, and they cost more than I'd pay for a month of groceries.
You look a bit pale.
Lena said to me.
You okay?
Yeah, I'm fine. I think that liqueur went to my head, that's all.
Shall we get a nightcap?
No! I shouted in panic. No. I repeated, this time a bit more gently and coolly. Let's go for a walk. I paid for the drinks and then we left the hotel. I didn't mention to Lena that it had been the most expensive round of drinks I ever paid for in my life. I just pretended I was the kind of journalist who typically popped into Le Maurice for a casual gin and tonic. Thank God we didn't get a room, I thought. Before calling it a night, we headed back to the Seine for one last stroll along the river. We cut through the deserted courtyard of the Louvre, past the glass pyramids, and stopped at the Pont du Carrousel bridge. We laughed, we smiled, and we watched the barges glide by. I remember thinking how lucky I was to be standing with a woman like her. It was a perfect Paris moment. That Valentine's Day still rates among the best nights I've had in my life. Cheap champagne, expensive gin and tonics, and the woman of my dreams on my arm. If you told me that in 3 years I'd be proposing to that same woman on that same bridge, I'd have believed it. Would you believe it?
That was so sweet.
5 years ago to the day.
It's so nice to relive that moment.
I'm interested if, while we were reading that, if anything jumped out at you as, 5 years on.
Yeah. Well, it's the big one is obviously the Eiffel Tower.
That's the big one for you? For me, it was it was that moment. But yeah, go on.
Okay, let me rephrase it. That's a slight detail for me, personally, is that you could walk under the Eiffel Tower. I remember we used to do it. It was quite often.
Yeah.
We went down there. You could just like stroll around and sit and have picnics underneath. It was just really nice. It's such a shame.
It used to be for people who couldn't be bothered walking up the steps or going to the top.
Yeah.
It was just as nice to walk under it.
I think it was nicer.
And
you could just walk there and look up, and it's like it's so big, it's so massive, and you feel tiny, and it's quite a special little moment.
You know, the other thing that jumped out at me is I think it's crazy that we went into like a fancy hotel on Valentine's Day. Like now I think, now I think I'd be thinking those kind of places are way too busy to even try. It's kind of surprising that we got a spot.
I know.
Yeah.
Also, maybe it was just, we were in a different little dream world.
I think so.
Yeah.
It was about a year that we were in that dream world, and that's sort of talked about later in the book. But I think we'll get on with the rest of the book. You'll be back.
I will.
In many chapters. But I just thought it'd be nice to do this bit on Valentine's Day.
It's special.
So see you in a few chapters.
All right.
You're going to move in with me soon. Spoiler alert.
I better pack my bags.